Righto, folks. We are going to cool things down a little bit now and head down to the Falkland Islands, and we're going to hear from Mike Lavery, our sub-Antarctic specialist, about managing Calafate there. So, Mike, take it away.
Thank you very much. Yeah, kia ora koutou. Hello again, everyone. About to take you off on another jet-setted adventure across the sub-Antarctics. Very similar destination this time, just with one stop not there, exact same animation. Popping across the Pacific to Chile, down to Punta Arenas, and then flying across to this little set of islands over here, the Falklands. So what is this place? It's a British overseas territory. You've got the two main islands that you can see there and nearly 800 smaller ones around the coast. Very small population, only around 3,500 people. Most of those are based up in that right-hand arrow, about 3,000 of them. The rest of the population is spread out across the remaining land. Over 90% of that land is agricultural. It's all privately owned. There's almost no public contained areas like we have here. They are all stuck in and around that Stanley area. A little bit of a background for them. The fishing industry makes up the bulk of their use, squidding, toothfish, stuff like that, and then the remaining is mostly made up with tourism and agriculture. And much like the rest of the subantarctics, there's some pretty amazing set of species down there: cetaceans, pinnipeds, seals, albatrosses, penguins. But what are we dealing with? So unlike you saw a South Georgia talk, which had a range of species, this here we are currently dealing with just one. That is this Berberis species, locally known as Calafate. Native to Patagonia, so that Chile and southern Chile and Argentina area. The fruit is a major part of the economy for Patagonia. It is very much one of those, if you try it, you will come back type fruits. Not a lot of use though in the Falklands, primarily used as fencing and shelter belting for livestock, a little bit like gorse. This native species, the Falklands thrush, is its primary distributor. They make quite a bit of use of the fruit when they come into season. There's a lot known about the species from Patagonia, but a lot of that is based on an economic perspective, how to grow it, how to make the most out of the fruiting. In terms of it being a pest species or anything about its climate adaptability, there's almost nothing. It's all how do we grow it rather than how is it growing. So for the Falklands, there's not a lot we really know about its future impacts. Its current impacts, though, are primarily economic. So this is very much an agricultural issue rather than a biodiversity issue at the moment. And what you can sort of see in that top corner is a photo of a sheep fleece riddled with Calafate spines, which you can see in that other top photo. Makes a bit of hard work for the shearers and the sheep and anyone else who has to handle that wool during that process, and it also lowers the quality of an already pretty low quality product if anyone's up with wool prices. So it makes a big difference for these guys. Where are we starting with this though? So in 2008 there was a large-scale risk assessment done for a lot of the British overseas territories, including the Falkland Islands, and they scored, based on a bunch of criteria, the introduced species on the island. As you can see up on the top there, Calafate scored pretty highly. I think we looked at the other day, the maximum score you could get is about 26, so 19 is pretty high up there. And you can see from the other list of the remaining sort of top species, none of those are necessarily uncommon to people who deal in the agricultural space, particularly Chilean rhubarb, gunner is up there, a lot of heathers and things that we're all pretty aware of. It took a little bit longer for things to get going though. Landowners sort of kicked up a bit more of a fuss later on down the line, and the government got together and started actually going over what is this going to look like and how are we going to tackle this coming forward. And you're looking at about 1,000 hectares of land that was estimated to have this plant going through it, and we'll have a look at that a bit closer in a minute. Initial concerns around eradication, but the aim was to try and get it back to a level that the landowners can manage, and I'm sure people are aware that's not necessarily something they want to jump on. So 4 years of initial funding was put in place, and Indigena, the international branch of Kaitiaki or Ngahere that we work for, jumped in 2019. So what did it look like? So when we arrived, this is the rough distribution of Calafate. You can see it's very clustered around a couple of main points, but there is a lot of just generic spread through the islands. As I say, it was a garden plant and it's just used for a lot of fencing in the area. But we're going to this really big red hotspot over on the western side of East Falklands. And we're primarily focused on these two farms. So these waypoints came from an initial survey done in 2015, focusing on these two farms where the bulk of the spread has occurred. The infestations were primarily centred around the two housing properties, and from there, as you can see, sort of more so in that top infestation, it's had a gradual progression west against the prevailing wind, which is kind of interesting as well. We did a little bit of a calculation based on what was there, and yeah, we're getting a rough 55 hectare spread distribution by the plant per annum. So if you were in the room yesterday morning when we delivered a torta, rolled down here and delivered a torta report, you'll be a little bit familiar with this, but I'll go through it very quickly. This is Kaitiaki's forest restoration framework. It's sort of our guide for how we get on top of management units in different species. Starts off here in the initial control phase. We're dealing with those mature species, prepping them, getting ready for future spraying, and dealing with that in a way that reduces the potential seed load for those infestations. We then come through, tackle those regrowth points, tackle any areas that might have been missed, and try to push that seed bank potential down to zero. And then you cycle down into the seed bank level, where you are just trying to keep on top of that and making sure that that spread doesn't come back through. And then finally, once that's all tucked off, you have a small window where you continue to keep that management in place just to make sure that you're not getting any further incursions from outside. But by this point, you shouldn't be dealing with anything from the inside infestations. Important again, as Roel mentioned, these things don't have to happen in order either. They can operate independently depending on surveys and other systems. So, taking that into account, we broke up the areas into management units. I optimistically use the paddocks as management units, but by crikey, some of those were big. Some of the biggest ones getting over 400 hectares on their own. So these are some big areas that we're looking at. We focused the initial control around those main centres, the biggest one being the Port Sussex house up the top, and work by the government, small work by the government and locals in the past had already occurred down in that southern area, which is highlighted in yellow, so we just stuck that straight into a follow-up phase where we could go in and deal with what had been missed or dealt with. And then around the outside with those smaller satellite populations down into surveillance, just so we can go out and check those as resources allow and see how that spread is going. So starting, we had a little bit of a hiccup initially because the landowners that kicked up the fuss about the plant then decided they didn't want control done on their land that year. So we moved on to the neighbours. And we started off with these 3 paddocks, over nearly 500 hectares of land covered with initial control and nearly 80,000 litres of chemical used in those fields trying to deal with that. Biggest challenges for us: access. This land is drying out very quickly with climate change. There's not a lot of available water here, and not a lot gets collected. Even rain events, it's all squalls. Basically, by the time it hits the ground, it's evaporated. It's really looking dire for some of these areas. Yeah, so we kicked off on these ones, and access at the same time is a big thing. These are steep, rolling hills. They are peat, so there's a lot of bogging potential. Dragging an 800 litre spray unit around through peat is a bit of a challenge. We got stuck a lot in those first few years, and luckily the neighbours are good sorts, and they came and pulled us out a few times. So cycle through these very quickly, but this is getting into those next couple of years. So after we got through those paddocks, we pushed ourselves back towards the house. We were now allowed to enter the original property, and we started moving in towards those centre areas around the house. Again, this was guided by an idea to bring the infestation closer to that central point, but also to fit around the landowners' farming operations as well. So taking into account shearing and lambing and all of these sorts of things. We did also, after the season, have a quite interesting little sort of pseudo trial done by the landowners from that first property, where they attempted to grow some of the seeds post spraying as well. Not many, it was 3 or 4, but still kind of an interesting little experiment where they got a 0% success rate after spraying. Because we come in at sort of the summer period, it gets into fruiting pretty quickly. So it's good to know that when we are hitting these plants, that there's this idea that hopefully that germination potential is gone, even though there are fruits available on those plants. That was unfortunately also after a 3-year gap post-COVID too. So we had to come back and do a lot of assessing of those areas that we'd already done. Come 2023, we continued to move in, and we came to tackle those core infestations. Again, we're covering large areas around the property, and we're still using a pretty heavy amount of herbicide across that period. And we had to start looking at trials for how we were going to tackle these larger areas in those successive stages of management as well. Then we got to the year just been, and this was a real mammoth effort. With the core infestations now pretty much locked up in that follow-up control, we moved on to those wider areas around the eastern side of those properties. This was a lot of walking, a lot of carrying a full knapsack for no reason. And we were able to cover off nearly 1,900 hectares on foot using sort of wider searching areas just in those lower density areas. Really important work, and it's something that I think it can get skipped over a lot, is looking at those wider areas, because it really honed us in on where those core infestations were, what the effort requirement was going to be further on, and we can pretty much tick off a lot of those areas and say we don't need to go there again. And as I was saying before, it means we can jump a lot of those steps in our framework, and as you'll see coming in a bit, some of those areas have gone straight into a protection stage where if and when we've got the time, we can go in and check any isolated satellite groups, but otherwise they're pretty much under control now. So we get a 8 to 9 week window most years, and you can see the herbicide use starting to tail off, which is awesome. Yeah, nearly 3,000 hectares of land covered primarily on foot, unfortunately mostly by me. A lot of walking. And this is now, with our 3 or 4 years of added input, this is the current spread of that population. So you can see there's quite a bit more input than that initial survey showed. But again, those outer areas, once you sort of leave the settlement, very, very low distribution. Landowners have come on board, and they've been really helpful with, as we're only there for a short window across that of the year, having them keeping an eye on the land and keeping a check on what the follow-up requirements are has been really helpful as well. And it's helped with community engagement. This is a small place. The community is a big part of your impact there. And you can see the pre and post control difference there. It's a very dense infestations, and these guys are pretty keen to get their grazing land back eventually. Big part of this has been just data. These islands, the governments don't really have any major concepts of weed control, so us coming in was a real eye-opener for them. But the keys always are data, data, and data. It gives people a really good idea of what you're dealing with, what they should expect in future years. And I couldn't stress enough how important that's been and how much they were wowed by seeing 1,800 hectares of track logs. And just for fun, we found this on Google Earth. Looking at it a couple years later, you can see in this area in and around the house the pink, very pinked out gullies where we've been doing spray control work, and you can kind of see up in this right-hand corner, this gully here where we got to just a couple of years ago, this being the core dense infestation. It takes up a lot of space that these guys need for pushing sheep through. So where are we at now? Like I said, we've moved some of those areas into later stages. They're not going to require a lot of management from us now, and they can be pretty much ticked over by landowners as they're doing, doing their usual day-to-day business, which is awesome. But a key thing for us now is going into that follow-up stage and finding out what the regrowth potential is. Those areas in the yellow, which have the dates on them, we did in 2019, 2020, so it's been a long gap. Luckily, with those landowner additions as well, we've been able to keep a track on when things are starting to fruit again, and we're only just starting to see some of those ones that might have been missed in those first years having fruit on them. So that's awesome. We've got a little bit of a window where we can operate around such a large landscape, which has made a big difference. Looking ahead, so a couple of really cool things have come out of this. The Department of Agriculture in the Falklands is now looking at bringing in weed control on a much wider scale. They weren't really looking at this in the past, and now it's becoming a key role for one of the people that we do a lot of work with, which is really cool. And we are now helping them push to some of their other species, and I'm sure a couple of these won't be strangers to some people here, particularly mouse-eared hawkweed. God help us trying to tackle that one, but it'll be an interesting trial anyway. But yeah, it's really cool that they are now starting to look at this as a wider problem, still primarily as an agricultural perspective rather than an environmental, but that is coming more and more into play. This little thing, sure nobody's heard about this, it's called iNaturalist. We've also started helping them bring that in too for identifying any species around the islands. Thanks a lot.
Awesome.